Welcome back to another episode of An Anthropologist and a Cat Discuss Judith Butler. Today we're covering Chapter 4 of Undoing Gender. This chapter is titled Undiagnosing Gender. So, this entire chapter is another one of those that I could probably just talk to you guys and we could cover a whole lot of ground. But this chapter spends most of its time discussing the different views of having a diagnosis for what was at the time of publishing of this book called Gender Identity Disorder. This was from the DSM-4. For those of you not familiar, it is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This is 4th edition. It's now the DSM-5, which changes gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, which is something we can discuss at a later time. So, there are people who want to keep the diagnosis, and there are those who don't want it. And Butler covers both sides very eloquently. There are some people who want to keep it because it offers certification to a condition and allows access to medical, resources and technological means for transitioning. But there are others who say to be diagnosed with gender identity disorder is to be found in some way to be ill, sick, wrong, out of order, abnormal, and to suffer a certain stigmatization as a consequence of the diagnosis being given at all. As a result, some activists, psychiatrists, and trans people have argued that the diagnosis should be eliminated altogether. I can agree with this point because, this stuff isn't a disorder. Autonomy is important, and that's a whole nother section here. There's a debate about this because the people who would like to keep the diagnosis, they're trying to gain financial assistance and for those who want to ground the practice of transsexuality. I don't exactly agree with that phrasing, but in a notion of autonomy. And then Butler has to ask whether these two views are actually in opposition to one another. Because if you want to transition, I may well need the diagnosis to help me achieve my goal. And achieving the goal is precisely an exercise of my autonomy. Which brings in how complex this debate is, because people who want to keep the diagnosis want to be able to, use it to get the medical resources to be able to transition. And then the people who don't want to keep it want to do so, which would have them be treated in non-pathological ways, which enhances their autonomy. Autonomy is a buzzword for this one. I also just love the word autonomy. And we see the concrete limits to any notion of autonomy that establishes the individual as alone, free of social conditions, without dependency on social instruments of various kinds. And Butler says, to understand the difference between these views, we have to ask how the diagnosis is actually lived. Does it help some people to live, to achieve the life that's worth living? Does it hinder some people, making them feel stigmatized, and in some cases contribute to a suicidal conclusion, we can't undermine the value of it, but at the same time, we have to look at the consequences of having such a diagnosis. And there are some groups that fully embrace this diagnosis for, we'll say, less good reasons, such as the, conservative groups who seek to correct homosexuality, such as the National Association of Research and Therapy of Homosexuality, argue that if you can identify GID, gender identity disorder, we're going to use that term in this because it's what Butler uses, but remember, it is now gender dysphoria, not GID. There's a 75% chance that you can predict homosexuality in that person as an adult, a result which for them is a clear abnormality and tragedy. Thus, the diagnosis of GID is in most cases a diagnosis of homosexuality, and the disorder attached to the diagnosis implies that homosexuality remains a disorder at all. It, got rid of. Homosexuality has not been in the DSM for a fairly long time. And by fairly long time, I mean like the 70s. The very way the groups like these conceptualize the relationship between GID and homosexuality is problematic. It's very problematic. If we're understanding it based on the perception of gender traits of the opposite sex, boys with feminine attributes and girls with masculine, then the assumption remains that the boy traits will lead to a desire for women, and the girl traits will lead to a desire for men. Both these cases, heterosexual desire is presumed. And then we go in, and Butler goes on further. Thus, we could argue somewhat facetiously that 100% of those diagnosed with GID turn out to be homosexual. And Butler, acknowledges the joke is irresistible only because it would so alarm the National Association of Research and Therapy of Homosexuality. It's important to consider more seriously how the map of sexuality and gender is radically misdescribed by those who think within these terms. And then, correlation between gender identity and sexual orientation are murky at best. In the words of, this is my inner statistics tutor going here, correlation does not equal causation. All of the people I tutored can tell you that that was one of my main points. I would give you my really good analogy about Starbucks and bear attacks, but this isn't the place for it. If you're interested, please leave a note in the comments. It would be a huge... we bring back the John Money. It would be a huge mistake to assume that gender identity causes sexual orientation, or that sexuality references in some necessary way a prior gender identity. This would only work if we used an exclusively heterosexual matrix, which we do not. And, you've got, there's this disjunction, you've got butches and femmes. It's, these crossings are... Excuse me. This gender identity, it constitutes what's most erotic and exciting. I'm not quite sure how, but that's because, I'm in a relationship that does not really tell me that. But the diagnosis wants to establish that gender is a relatively permanent phenomenon. Like if you're going in to, get a therapist, a psychiatrist to sign off on you having GID, you don't want to go into a clinic and say it was only after you read a book by Kate Bornstein that you realized that you wanted to do, but it wasn't really conscious for you in that time. It can't be that cultural life has changed, because this diagnosis wants to establish that gender is a permanent phenomenon. Gender is fluid. Like, really. You cannot explicitly subscribe to a view that changes in gendered experience follow upon changes in social norms, since that would not suffice to satisfy the Harry Benjamin standard rules for the care of GID. In those, they presume that we all more or less know already what norms for gender are, and that all we really need to do is figure out whether they are being embodied in this instance or some other. So, we can't eradicate the thing itself, because people need, in some cases, people actually need this diagnosis to get things. And like how I referenced Dean Spade in the last chapter? I think I referenced it in the last chapter. It was referenced in the last chapter. People can use the diagnosis just as a vehicle for achieving one's goals. But then you have, children and teens, young trans teens who, may not be able to understand the, facetious use of the diagnosis to achieve one's goals, may cause emotional damage or self-esteem to a child who has no mental disorder. And then, one of the main arguments for keeping the diagnosis is the need for poor, working class, and middle class trans aspirants to have for medical insurance, because in a lot of cases, you can't get, top surgery or bottom surgery, well, without insurance, for one, and two, without a diagnosis. One of the best suggestions I think that's made in this chapter is taking the diagnosis out of the hands of the medical professional altogether. It should be between the client and medical doctor exclusively, not psychologists and psychiatrists. Because, the certification of stable mental health is not required for, breast reduction or menopausal ingestion of estrogen. This, intervention inserts a paternalistic structure to the process and undermines the very autonomy as basis for the claim of entitlement to begin with. But then you also run into the issue whether medical practitioners with no particular background in mental health will nevertheless use mental health criteria to make the decisions that could be no less favorable than those made by mental health practitioners. So pretty much what I'm, there's two different conceptions of autonomy here, and, it's just a hot-ass mess. But society doesn't consider itself to have a right to stop a woman from enlarging or diminishing her breasts, And we don't consider penile enhancement to be a problem unless it's being done by an illegitimate doctor who botches the results. Ladies and gentlemen, don't go to Mexico for surgery. No one gets sent to a psychiatrist for announcing a plan to cut or grow his or her hair or go on a diet unless one is at a risk for anorexia, which, understandable. Eating disorders are serious. Don't. Just don't. Although it is obvious that not all individuals diagnosed with GID are or wish to become transsexual, they are nevertheless affected by the use of a diagnosis to further the aims of transsexuals, since to use the diagnosis is to strengthen its status as a useful instrument. Which that is a legitimate concern, because even using it facetiously, you're giving the profession the idea that this diagnosis actually works, which obviously does not compute in the way that it should. So, that's where I'm going to leave off this chapter. Have any questions, comments, recipes? Leave them in the comments below. And I will see you next time for Chapter 5. Is kinship always heterosexual? Have a great day, guys. Bye.